She stood in a hall of 10,000 wolves, and not one of them defended her. The man she would have died for, the man she had bled for, sacrificed for, built her entire existence around, looked her dead in the eyes and chose someone else, right there, in front of everyone. No warning, no mercy, just a public execution dressed up as a ceremony. Here's what nobody tells you about that kind of betrayal. It doesn't just break your heart. It breaks your belief in yourself. It makes you wonder if you were ever worth anything at all. But sometimes the worst night of your life is also the last night you spend small. Stay with me until the end. Drop your city in the comments, and let's find out if this story hits different where you are. She had rehearsed the walk 100 times, down the long corridor of black stone and silver torchlight, past the rows of stone-faced royal guards who had watched her grow from a pale, uncertain girl into something that at least looked like a queen. Past the crimson banners bearing the Thorn Dynasty's iron wolf crest, banners she had spent 3 years learning to stand beneath without flinching. Past the murmuring crowd of nobles and pack representatives who filled the grand ceremonial hall like a flood tide, all those sharp eyes, all those sharper whispers, until she reached the elevated platform at the far end where Draven would be waiting. That was how the Bond night was supposed to go. Luna Seraphine Vale had mapped every footstep in her mind until she could have walked it blind. She knew exactly which marble tile had a hairline crack near the eastern pillar. She knew the third torch on the left burned slightly cooler than the rest, throwing a shadow that would catch her silver gown wrong if she didn't angle her shoulder. She knew that the crowd would part not out of affection, but out of custom, and she had made her peace with that years ago. She had made her peace with a lot of things. That was her first mistake. The hall smelled of pine resin and cold iron, the way it always did when the kingdom gathered for something that would be written down afterward. 10,000 wolves packed into tiered galleries of carved stone, dressed in the colors of their respective territories, the deep burgundy of the eastern reaches, the gray and ash of the northern clans, the pale cream of the lowland packs who traveled 3 days just to witness a king take his queen. Their collective body heat warmed the air to something close to fever, and the noise of them, the low hum of conversation that never quite settled into silence, pressed against Seraphine's chest like a second heartbeat. She stood at the corridor entrance and breathed, in, out. Her handmaiden Mira hovered at her left shoulder, close enough that Seraphine could feel the girl's anxiety radiating off her like steam off stone in winter. Mira was 17, recently assigned, and had the particular misfortune of genuinely caring about the Luna she served. She'd been straightening and re-straightening the same fold of Seraphine's gown for the past 4 minutes. "You're going to pull a thread," Seraphine said quietly. Mira stopped. "Sorry, my Luna. Your hem on the left side is fine." She caught the girl's wrist, gentle but firm. "I need you to breathe with me. Can you do that?" The handmaiden looked up at her with wide brown eyes, and for just a moment Seraphine saw her own fear reflected back, raw and honest and unable to hide. It was oddly steadying. She squeezed Mira's wrist once and let go. "Stand straight," Seraphine told her. "Whatever happens in there, you stand straight." She was 23 years old. She had been promised to Draven Thorn since she was 16, a political arrangement between her father's mountain pack and the Thorn dynasty that carried enough strategic weight to have kept 3 border wars from igniting over the years. She had arrived at the palace as a girl who barely spoke above a murmur and spent her first year here learning not to disappear into the walls. Nobody had been cruel to her. Not exactly. Cruelty required engagement, and the palace had mostly offered her indifference, a category of loneliness so particular it had its own texture, its own smell, its own way of pressing on the back of your throat at 2 in the morning when the corridors were dark, and you couldn't sleep, and you were trying very hard not to wonder whether anyone would notice if you weren't here. Draven had been the exception, not kind. She wouldn't have called him kind, even then. He was hard and territorial and profoundly uninterested in softness, built like something that had been tested repeatedly by things that could have broken it and chose not to. When he spoke, the room recalibrated. When he walked into a space, the air changed pressure. He was 28 when she arrived and already wore power the way other men wore skin, like he'd been born inside it and couldn't imagine being otherwise. But he had talked to her. Not often, not warmly. But he had sought her out in the East Garden one evening in her second year, stood beside her in silence for several long minutes while she pretended to read, and then said without preamble, "My advisors think you're too quiet to be useful." She'd looked up from her book. "And what do you think?" He'd studied her with those gray eyes that never seemed to settle into one temperature. Not warm, not cold. Something more unsettling than either. "I think quiet people are either hiding something or carrying something. I haven't decided which you are." She should have told him to go to hell. In retrospect, that might have been the one response that could have altered the entire trajectory of what came after. But she was 19 and she was lonely, and he was paying attention to her, and so instead she had said something honest. Why can't it be both? He'd almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. That was where it began. Not with flowers or declarations or the kind of courtship that got written into songs, but with two people who were both, in their separate ways, carrying things, and found a strange equilibrium in occasionally setting those things down near each other. She had loved him by the time she was 20. She had known she loved him by the time she was 21, in the way you know a thing when it stops being a feeling and becomes structural, when it gets into the bones of your daily life so completely that you stop noticing it's there until something threatens it, and then the panic is total and primitive. She had told him, once, just once, because she was not a woman who said things twice if she meant them. He had not said it back. He had looked at her for a long moment with that unreadable gray gaze, and then he had touched the side of her face. 1 hand, 2 seconds, no more, and walked away. And she had let herself believe that was enough. She had let herself believe that Draven Thorn showed his feelings in the way a man of iron shows anything, sideways, grudgingly, in small pieces that you had to learn to read. She had been reading him for 3 years. She had been wrong about all of it. The hall doors opened. The crowd noise swelled and then hushed in that particular sequence that meant a figure of importance had entered. The royal herald's voice cut across the stone vaulting with practiced precision. Luna Seraphine Vale of the Vale Mountain Pack, intended consort to His Majesty King Alpha Draven Thorn of the Thorn Dynasty, first of his name, sovereign of the Northern Reaches. And that was her cue. She walked. The silver gown caught the torchlight the way she knew it would. Her shoulders were back. Her chin was level. The crack in the marble tile passed under her left foot without incident. The third torch on the left threw its cooler shadow across her shoulder, and she angled just slightly, and it didn't matter. None of it mattered. She was 40 feet into the hall when she first felt it. That particular quality of silence that wasn't reverence, but something closer to held breath. The kind of silence a crowd makes when it knows something the person walking forward doesn't. She caught it in the peripheral shift of faces, in the way conversations hadn't just paused but stopped, in the unusual stillness of hands that should have been fidgeting with cups and rings and cuffs. She kept walking, 60 feet. The platform was visible now, and Draven was visible on it, standing in the formal black and gunmetal of the Thorn formal armor, his dark hair pulled back, his expression doing the thing it always did in public, closing off, shuddering, becoming stone, because he had decided stone was the appropriate face for this room. She had always been able to read the difference between his real stone and his public stone. The real stone had cracks you could see if you looked carefully enough. She was looking carefully. She couldn't read him at all. 80 feet, 90. She was close enough now to see the individual faces in the front rows. Lord Commander Viel, with his red-veined nose and his diplomatic neutrality that was never actually neutral, Chancellor Haas, who had spent 2 years treating her like furniture, the pack representatives from the lowlands who had traveled 3 days and were now watching her with expressions she couldn't name. And then she saw Celine. She had known Celine existed. You couldn't spend 3 years inside the palace walls without developing a functional intelligence network, even if that network consisted primarily of Mira's careful observations and the pattern of which corridors were used at unusual hours. Celine was 26, dark-haired, with the kind of beauty that announced itself immediately and left no room for negotiation, the sort of face that made other faces feel provisional. She was the daughter of a southern coastal pack lord, and she had been at court for 8 months under the designation of diplomatic envoy, which was a title that fooled nobody. Seraphine had chosen not to confront it. She had made a calculation, cold and surgical, that confronting it would cost more than absorbing it, that Draven's politics were complicated, that men of his particular kind sometimes needed to exhaust certain impulses before they could commit to what actually mattered, that the bond ceremony itself would resolve the ambiguity in a way that nothing else could. She had trusted the bond ceremony. She stopped walking at 15 feet from the platform because the configuration of the bodies on it had just resolved into something her brain was refusing to process correctly. Celine was standing on the platform, not in the gallery, not in the front rows. On the platform, in a gown of deep scarlet that had been specifically cut for this kind of visibility, standing at Draven's right hand with an ease that spoke of rehearsal. Seraphine stood very still. The hall was completely silent now. Draven's gray eyes found hers across the 15 feet of open marble floor, and what she saw in them hit her somewhere below comprehension. Not guilt exactly, not apology, but something more devastating than either. Certainty. The specific calm of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it and has moved past the part where the cost of it bothers him. Seraphine. His voice carried the full hall without effort, the way it always did. Deep and even and perfectly controlled. You've served this kingdom with loyalty these 3 years, and I want you to know that service is acknowledged. The words arrived in her body before they arrived in her mind. The specific grammar of them, past tense, formal third person, the word served, was doing something to her chest that she had no language for. I want to be clear with this kingdom and with every pack represented here tonight. He didn't look away from her. That was almost the worst part. He had the decency, or the cruelty, to look directly at her while he did it. The bond I recognize is not the bond that was arranged. A sound moved through the crowd, not quite a gasp, not quite a murmur, something between the two. The collective processing of 10,000 people watching something irreversible happen. Celine of the Crestfall Coast is the woman I choose. Here, in front of this kingdom, my queen. He reached over and took Celine's hand. Seraphine didn't move. She was aware in a strange and detached way of the physics of what her body was doing, the way her breathing had gone shallow and mechanical, the way her hands had found each other in front of her and locked without her telling them to, the way her feet had rooted to the floor with a precision that had nothing to do with composure and everything to do with the fact that moving felt categorically impossible. She could hear laughter starting somewhere in the upper galleries. Not everyone. She would clarify this later to herself during the long hours of darkness that followed. It was not everyone laughing. But enough. Enough that it became the soundtrack of the moment, that particular sharp-edged amusement that crowds produce when someone else's humiliation is sufficiently spectacular. I should leave, she thought. The thought was very clear and very quiet, sitting in the center of her skull like a stone in still water. I should turn around and walk out of this hall, and I should do it right now. She didn't move for 4 full seconds. Later, she would count them. She would return to those 4 seconds more times than she could track, turning them over in the dark, examining them from different angles, wondering what might have happened if she had used them differently. In the 4th second, Chancellor Haas stepped down from the platform gallery and crossed to her with the brisk, businesslike manner of a man managing an administrative inconvenience. "Luna Seraphine," he said, keeping his voice low enough that only she and the nearest few rows could hear it. "His Majesty has asked that you remain through the formal proceedings. There's a symbolic function still to be fulfilled, and your absence would create a procedural complication." She looked at him. The Chancellor was 61 years old and had served 3 kings and prided himself on having navigated every political catastrophe this dynasty had generated with his composure intact. He was looking at her right now with the expression of a man who was not entirely comfortable with what he had just said, but had committed to it anyway. "A symbolic function," she repeated. "The ceremony requires a Luna present for the binding declaration. His Majesty, he wants me to stand here." Her voice came out quiet and very level. "While he bonds with her, he wants me to stand here and watch." Haas's jaw tightened fractionally. "These are His Majesty's wishes, and what's my alternative?" He paused. "I'm sorry?" "If I leave." She held his eyes with a steadiness that was costing her more than she would ever admit. "What does he do, concretely? What is the consequence?" The Chancellor's gaze shifted, just barely, just for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction she saw the truth he wasn't going to say out loud. There was no consequence. This was not an instruction backed by real force. It was a preference dressed up as an order, The assumption that she would comply because she had always complied. Because compliance was what Seraphine Vale did. Because she had spent 3 years absorbing indignity so smoothly that everyone in this palace had mistaken her endurance for docility. "I see," she said. She turned and looked at the platform one more time. Draven was watching her. Celine had her hand on his arm and was saying something to him with her face turned toward his ear, but his eyes were on Seraphine, still, focused, unreadable in that specific way that she had spent 3 years learning to read. She read him one last time. What she found there was not cruelty. It would have been easier if it had been cruelty. What she found was indifference dressed in regret. The expression of a man who understood intellectually that he was causing damage, but who had already completed the internal accounting and decided the damage was an acceptable line item. She had been a line item. She had always been a line item, and she had been too busy believing she was something more to see it. Seraphine turned and walked back the way she had come. The crowd didn't part the same way on the return. People pressed closer now, the way crowds do when the spectacle has resolved into something they don't have to be respectful about anymore. She heard words that she catalogued and filed and refused to let land. Pathetic. Knew she was never right for him. Did you see her face? The laughter in the upper galleries had evolved into something more conversational, the way a fire settles from its first explosive burn into the steadier, patient consumption that does the real damage. Mira was at the corridor entrance, white as chalk, her hands twisted together in front of her. Seraphine walked past her without stopping. "Come," was all she said. They moved through the back corridors together, the servant passages that Seraphine had learned early because they were quieter and because she had understood from her first month in this palace that silence was a resource she needed to protect. The stones down here were rougher, unpolished, functional. Torches in iron brackets instead of the silver ones in the ceremonial corridors. The sounds of the hall faded behind them, replaced by the palace's structural sounds. The distant percussion of kitchens, the faint animal noise from the stable quarter, the wind off the northern ridge pushing through the narrow windows set high in the stone. "My Luna," Mira said, behind her. Just that. Just her title, like an anchor being offered. "Don't," Seraphine said. "I'm so—" "Mira." She stopped walking. She was standing in the middle of a back corridor at the intersection of 2 passages, one leading to the Luna's quarters and one leading toward the eastern service gate. She stood at that intersection for a long moment, aware of a specific and complete exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. "Don't apologize. You have nothing to apologize for." "I should have warned you. I heard things the last 2 days, things I should have. You did warn me." She turned to look at the girl. "In your way. I chose not to hear it." That was true. There had been signals, small and deniable and individually ignorable, but signals. She had chosen the interpretation that cost her less in the moment. That choice had an invoice, and it had been presented tonight with extreme efficiency. Seraphine looked at the 2 passages in front of her. She had lived in this palace for 3 years. Her rooms were in the eastern wing, 2nd floor, 4 windows facing the ridge. She knew every stone of them. She had decorated them carefully and deliberately, building the kind of space that could hold her. Warm enough to sleep in, organized enough to think in, personal enough to remind her every morning that she existed as a specific person and not just a function of someone else's political arrangement. She had built a life in this palace, a small, careful, provisional life, but a life. She understood, standing at this intersection, that it was over, not because of what Draven had done. That was only the public declaration of a thing that had been true for longer than she wanted to calculate. The life was over because she was different now. And the person she had become in the last 20 minutes could not live inside the shape of the person she had been before them. "I'm leaving," she said. Mira went very still. "Tonight?" "Yes." "My Luna, it's the 3rd hour. The gates are—" "The Eastern Service Gate doesn't close until the 5th hour on ceremony nights because the kitchen deliveries run late." She began moving again toward the Eastern Passage. "I need you to go back to my quarters and take the brown leather case under the bed. Inside it, there's a wrapped bundle at the bottom. Don't open it, just bring it to the gate. Can you do that?" "Yes," Mira said immediately, without hesitation, and Seraphine felt something in her chest shift at the simplicity of it. The uncomplicated loyalty of a 17-year-old girl choosing a side without needing to be asked twice. If anyone stops you, you're running an errand for the kitchen. You found the case in the corridor. You don't know what's in it. Yes, my Luna. And Mira. She stopped once more, turned back to the girl. In the torchlight, Mira looked very young and very frightened and very determined, all at once. After tonight, if anyone asks, you saw me go to my rooms. You went to sleep. You don't know when I left or where I went. A pause. Then, I never saw anything. Seraphine looked at her for a moment. Then she said very quietly, thank you, and turned and walked into the eastern passage. The night outside the service gate was cold with the particular bite of northern altitude. Thin air and no moisture, and stars so sharp-edged they looked aggressive. Seraphine stood in the shadow of the outer wall and breathed it in. The leather case was in her hands. Mira had arrived 3 minutes ahead of her, wide-eyed and out of breath. They had said nothing further. Seraphine had put her hand briefly on the girl's shoulder, felt the shake in it, and then walked through the gate. The palace was loud behind her. The ceremony was still ongoing. She could hear it distantly, that particular resonance of collective sound that stone buildings generate when they're full. They were bonding in there. Draven and Celine before 10,000 wolves, while the rejected Luna's absence was probably being noted and processed and absorbed into whatever narrative the court would construct. She didn't look back. The northern path from the service gate ran along the outer wall for a quarter mile before hitting the tree line. She knew it because she had walked it on mornings when she needed to think, and the palace felt too compressed to think inside. Beyond the tree line, it became the old ridge trail, technically within palace territory for the first 3 miles, and then entering the unclaimed highland territory that connected the Thorn domain with the northern pack territories. She was 3 months past 23. She had no political backing. The Vale Mountain Pack had sent her here at 16 and invested whatever interest they had in her directly into the Thorn Alliance, an alliance that was now publicly dissolved. She had 2 changes of clothes, a leather case with currency she had been setting aside for 2 years in the particular quiet way that people set things aside when they don't want to name the fear that makes them do it, a bone-handled knife, and a general sense of north. She walked into the trees. It took her perhaps an hour to put the palace out of earshot, and another hour to put it out of sight when she hit a ridge point where the view opened behind her. She didn't stop at the ridge. She noted the palace lights on the horizon with the detachment of something that had already been processed and filed, and kept moving. The cold got worse above the tree line. She pulled her outer layer tighter and kept her pace deliberate. Not running, because running in the dark on uneven ground was how you turned an ankle, and she needed all 4 working parts right now. The stars gave enough light to see by once her eyes had adjusted. An owl worked the darkness somewhere above and to the left, its wing beats inaudible, only the sound of its landing giving it away. She was 2 hours out when she heard them, 3 of them, moving through the trees below and to the east, at a pace that was coordinated in the specific way of wolves who know each other's rhythm without having to check. She stopped, pressed back against the nearest large trunk, slowed her breathing the way she'd learned to slow it, deep and quiet and deliberate, not the fast, shallow panic breathing that radiates heat and smell. She had told herself she was past the palace territory. She had misjudged by half a mile. The 3 figures came out of the trees 40 feet below her and stopped. They were large. She could see that much in the star dim, the particular mass of pack wolves on a scent trace, moving with purpose and with patience. They were not Draven's personal guard. The personal guard wore the charcoal and iron of the Thorn House colors even on informal duty. These wore nothing she recognized. Tracks fresh, one of them said. Voice low, male, carrying the flattened vowels of the northeastern pack territories. A pause from the second figure. Then, 2 hours, maybe less. Heading north. Yeah, a silence that had the texture of people making decisions. We bring her in? The first voice said. That's not the order. The second voice carried a different quality, quieter but with a particular steadiness that read as authority. The order is make contact. After that, she decides. Seraphine's hands were very still against the tree bark. The cold of it was biting through the fabric of her sleeves in a way she was choosing not to feel. She was running a fast calculation. The angles, the distances, the question of whether she could move through the upper rock before they closed it. She came out from behind the tree. All 3 of them turned. Fast, precise, the reflex of trained wolves, but no aggression in the stance, which she noticed and filed immediately. "How long have you been tracking me?" she said. The central figure, the second voice, the one she'd tagged as the decision-maker, stepped forward. He was tall, broader than the other two, wearing dark traveling clothes and a heaviness about the eyes that she'd seen before in people who operated in territory where care had consequences. He studied her with a directness that was entirely unsentimental. "Long enough," he said. "For who?" A pause. He reached into his jacket and produced something, small, flat, the size of a palm, and held it out toward her. She crossed the 40 feet and took it from his hand. It was a token. Black stone, worked into the shape of a wolf at full run, with a symbol she didn't fully recognize carved into the reverse. She turned it in her fingers. "What is this?" "An invitation," the man said, "from Alpha Kale Duskbane of the Black Wolf clan." His eyes were steady on her face. "He's been watching your situation for some time. He wants you to know there's a place, if you want one, on your own terms." Seraphine looked at the token in her palm. Behind her, 2 hours distant, a palace full of wolves was in the final moments of a bond ceremony that should have been hers. The man who had spent 3 years almost treating her like she mattered was standing on a platform with another woman and a crown he had not earned, and a kingdom that was already quietly, steadily beginning to rot from the inside. In front of her, 3 strangers in the northern dark, offering her a door she hadn't known existed. She closed her fingers around the token. "Tell me," she said, "about the Black Wolf clan." The tall man studied her for another moment. Then something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but recalibrating, adjusting to accommodate a version of her that was evidently not what he'd been briefed to expect. "That's going to be a long conversation," he said. "Then we should start walking." She turned north without waiting for a response. She heard them fall in behind her, the sound of 3 sets of boots finding their rhythm, adjusting to hers. And she walked into the dark with the Black Wolf token still pressed against the center of her palm, already warm from her skin, and behind her eyes the image of a gray-eyed king standing on a torchlit platform, making the worst decision of his long and documented life. She had walked away from the ceremony without crying. She had walked out of the palace without crying. She had climbed for 2 hours through cold, dark territory without crying. She was not going to cry now. "You become what you survive," she thought, and the thought had the quality of a door closing. Not with violence, but with the solid and absolute finality of a door that knows it isn't opening again. She walked. The stars burned. And in the palace, 2 hours behind her, in a hall full of witnesses, in front of every pack that mattered on the continent, the bond was being spoken. The mark was being placed. The king was cementing the choice that would define everything that came after, what none of them knew. Not Draven, not Celine, not the crowd who had laughed, not the chancellor with his procedural concerns, was that the woman walking north through the cold and the dark was not what she appeared to be. She was not fleeing. She was arriving. And 6 miles north, at the edge of Black Wolf territory, where 3 scouts had just sent a signal fire into the sky above a camp of 200 wolves, a man with ice-pale eyes and a reputation that made border lords sweat in their beds was looking at the smoke and waiting for a woman he had never met. A woman he had been watching from a careful distance for long enough to know one thing with certainty. Whatever Draven Thorn had thrown away tonight, Kale Duskbane intended to find out exactly what it was. The smoke rose in the cold northern air. The signal had been answered. Seraphine Vale, former Luna of the Thorn dynasty, walked out of the last edge of palace territory at exactly the moment the bond ceremony completed behind her, and stepped into the darkness on the other side of the line, with a Black Wolf token in her fist and 3 strangers at her back and no idea, yet, that the man waiting for her at the other end of this walk was about to become the most important person in the rest of her life. The birds above the northern ridge startled off their perches all at once, sudden and collective, as if something had moved through the dark and displaced the air. Something had. She kept walking. She didn't look back. And in the camp ahead, Kyle Duskbane turned away from the signal fire and said 3 words to the wolf standing at his right shoulder, words that would change everything, though neither of them knew it yet. He said, "Bring her in." The woman he brought in would not be the woman he expected, and what he offered her as shelter would become, in time, the thing that changed the shape of the continent. But that, That is the next part of the story. The camp materialized out of the dark, the way things do when they've been designed not to be found. Gradually, in pieces, details that only resolved into a whole when you were already inside it. First there was the smell. Wood smoke cut with pine tar and cold iron, the particular combination of a camp that moved regularly and knew how to disappear. Then the sound. Low, controlled, the quiet of people who had learned that noise was a resource you spent carefully. Then the light, banking fires set deep within natural rock breaks, angled so they threw nothing upward into the sky that passing scouts from rival territories might read. Seraphine walked into it with her chin level and her hands visible. The three wolves who had brought her in, the tall decision-maker and his two flanking men, none of whom had given her names and she hadn't asked, stopped at the camp's outer perimeter, and a different energy moved through the space immediately. People registered her, not loudly, not with the dramatic stillness of the palace hall, but with the specific, functional attention of a group that survived by knowing instantly what was new in its environment. Eyes tracked her from firelight to shadow. She counted 7 visible watchers and assumed twice that many she couldn't see. These were Black Wolf Clan. Their reputation ran north of brutal on the continental scale. The pack that didn't negotiate, didn't hold ground without meaning to keep it, didn't take people in without understanding precisely why. She understood she was being assessed. She let them assess. The tall man, she had started thinking of him as the handler, for lack of anything else, stopped in front of a tent set slightly back from the main cluster, differentiated from the others by size and by the absence of anyone nearby. A space that had been cleared, not naturally. "He's inside," the handler said. "Alone." "Should I be concerned about that?" A pause. "Not in the way you might think." She looked at him directly. "What way should I be concerned?" He met her eyes, and something that might have been the very beginning of respect shifted in his expression. "He doesn't waste time," he said. "Don't mistake directness for hostility. They're not the same thing with him." She filed that, pulled back the tent flap, and walked in. The interior was functional to the point of statement. A camp table with maps pinned flat by iron weights, a field chair, 2 oil lamps burning at different heights, a bedroll that had clearly not been slept in tonight. Standing with his back to her at the far side of the table, studying one of the maps with the focus of a man working through a problem he'd been sitting with for some time, was Kyle Duskbane. She had heard descriptions. Descriptions had not been adequate. He was built the way the northern terrain was built. Nothing unnecessary, nothing decorative. Everything load-bearing. Dark clothing, no insignia that she could see. Hair that was either black or very dark brown in the lamplight and cut close on the sides in a way that was functional rather than fashionable. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years past it. When he turned, it was without hurry, and his face had the quality of terrain that has been weathered into its final form. Prominent bones, a jaw that had taken at least one serious impact at some point in the past, and eyes the color of ice over deep water. Light surface, unknown depth. He looked at her the way she imagined he looked at the maps. "You took the token," he said. "I'm here," she said. "That answers the question." A pause. "Sit down." "I've been walking for 2 hours. I'd rather stand." Something moved through his expression. Not irritation, something more like recalibration. The same adjustment the handler had made when she'd come out from behind the tree. She was not who they had been prepared for. She found she didn't care. "All right," he said. "Then I'll be fast." He turned back to the map and put one hand flat on it. "You know who I am." "By reputation." "What's the reputation say?" "That you don't lose territory once you've taken it. That you've got 6 former enemy pack lords who are now either dead or subordinate. That you haven't been beaten in the field in 4 years, and the 2 times before that, the people who beat you are themselves dead now, which suggests a pattern." She paused. "And that you don't do things without a reason that serves you directly." He let that last sentence sit in the air between them. "Which brings you to why I sent for you," he said. "It does. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it straight." He turned to face her fully now, arms loose at his sides, posture that was relaxed in the way of people who don't need to perform readiness because readiness is just their default state. "I've been watching the Thorn Court for 2 years. Political intelligence, resource mapping. Draven Thorn is going to lose his kingdom in the next 3 to 5 years, and I want to be correctly positioned when that happens." She was quiet. "You were in that court for 3 years," he continued. "You know the internal architecture of it, who actually holds power, which alliances are real, and which ones are theater, where the structural weaknesses are. That's valuable. You want information. Among other things." She studied him. "What are the other things?" "I want an ally who understands the Northern Pact territories from the inside out and can operate in diplomatic contexts I can't walk into without immediately making them military." He said it with the complete absence of ego that she recognized as either genuine confidence or a very refined performance of it. She was going to have to spend more time with him to know which. "You're a veil. Your bloodline carries diplomatic currency, even stripped of the Thorn connection. Maybe more so now because you're not carrying his political liabilities." "I've just been publicly humiliated in front of the entire continent," she said flatly. "My diplomatic currency is at its lowest possible value right now." "Tonight it is." His eyes stayed level on hers. "In 6 months, it won't be." "You're certain of that?" "I'm certain that the story of a rejected Luna who walked out of that hall and into the Black Wolf clan is a story the continent is going to be telling for the next decade. The question is what version of that story gets told." A pause. "I'd like it to be the version where she came north and became something that made Draven Thorn regret every single thing he did in that hall tonight." The tent was quiet except for the low crackle of the oil lamps. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. She was tired in a way that went past muscle and bone into something more systemic, and the lamplight was pressing warmly against the right side of her face. And somewhere in the camp outside, a wolf was laughing at something. Low and genuine, the kind of laugh that meant safety. And all of it together was doing something to the wall she'd been holding up since the corridor entrance of the grand ceremonial hall. She didn't let it fall. "Tell me what the arrangement looks like," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. An acknowledgement. "Sit down first." "I thought you were going to be fast." I lied. He pulled the second camp chair from under the table. "Sit down. This is going to take a while." She sat. They talked until the lamps needed refilling. Not about feelings, not about the palace, or Draven, or what had happened in that hall. None of it surfaced in the conversation because neither of them brought it there. And she understood that this was a specific and deliberate courtesy on his part, the kind of courtesy that costs nothing to perform and signals everything about what a person thinks you're worth. He treated her like a strategic entity from the first sentence to the last, asked questions that assumed competence, pushed back when her answers were imprecise in a way that was direct without being unkind. And by the time the sky outside the tent flap had shifted from black to the specific dark blue that precedes dawn, she had given him more genuine information about the Thorn Court's internal structure than she had ever given anyone. She noticed, somewhere in the 3rd hour, that she had stopped calculating how much to reveal. She noticed it and filed it for later examination. At some point, a young wolf came in silently with food, dense trail bread, and something hot in 2 tin cups that turned out to be a bark tea that tasted like forest floor and did something useful to the ache behind her eyes. Kale took his without looking up from the map he was walking her through, and she took hers the same way, and they sat across the camp table from each other, eating and drinking in a silence that was entirely comfortable in a way she couldn't immediately account for. "When's the last time you sat in silence with someone and didn't feel like you had to earn it?" she thought, and then locked that thought away immediately. "You'll need a tent tonight," he said eventually. "Tonight is almost over. Then a tent for the rest of it." He stood, stretched, the unself-conscious movement of someone who had been still for too long, and looked at her across the table. "You can decide the rest in the morning, whether you stay, what the terms look like, what you want out of this." He paused. "What you want, not just what's strategically viable. I want to know the actual thing." She looked up at him. "Why?" "Because I've dealt with enough people who buried what they actually wanted under 3 layers of calculated positioning, and those people make decisions that are half-blind." He held her gaze without apology. "You've spent 3 years in a court that trained you to want the right things. I'm not interested in the right things. I'm interested in the real ones." A silence. "Get some sleep," he said. "We'll talk again." She spent the first 2 hours of morning in a tent that smelled like clean canvas and cold ground, staring at the sloped fabric above her with her hands folded on her stomach, running a calculation that had nothing strategic about it. The simple and entirely private question of whether she was broken or just restructuring. Both, she decided. The restructuring is what happens when the breaking gets to a certain depth. She had felt this before at 16 when they sent her to the palace. That specific sensation of a self being disassembled by circumstance and the terrifying gap before the new configuration became clear. She had survived that process once. The knowledge that she had survived it was not comforting exactly, but it was factual, and facts were what she had to work with. She slept for 3 hours. When she woke, the camp was in its daytime rhythm, functional, low noise, carrying the particular energy of people who had purpose and trusted the structure they were operating inside. Nobody looked at her with curiosity or sympathy or the careful avoidance of either that people perform when they think you're fragile. They looked at her the way they looked at everything in the camp, with brief practical assessment and then back to their own work. She ate with the camp, found a place at one of the communal fires without being invited or excluded, accepted a bowl from the wolf, managing the cookpot without ceremony, ate in silence beside 2 others who were doing the same. "You're the Luna," one of them said eventually. Not a question. "Former," she said. A pause. Then, "Kael's people don't have former. You're here. You're here." A shrug. "You leave. You're somewhere else. But nobody stays former." She looked at the man, mid-30s, a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw, eating with the efficient focus of someone who is going to be needed somewhere in 20 minutes. Is that meant to be reassuring? It's meant to be accurate. He stood with his bowl. There's a difference. She watched him go. By mid-morning, Kael found her at the camp's eastern edge, where the tree line opened onto a plateau that showed the full spread of the northern highlands, gray and silver and enormous under a sky that had gone the color of polished pewter. She was standing with her arms crossed against the cold, watching the distance with the focused non-focus of someone thinking through something large. He came to stand beside her, not close, 2 feet of air between them, enough that it was clearly a choice. They looked at the highlands together for a moment. "Your bloodline," he said. "You know about the Vale lineage. I know what every Vale knows. Border pack, good fighters, moderate diplomatic history, consistent alliance record. That's the official record." He paused. "What do you know about the bloodline before your grandfather's generation?" She looked at him sideways. "Why?" "Because I had a research specialist pull historical pack records 3 months ago, and what she found changes some of the assumptions about why your match to Draven was considered so significant." He turned his head to look at her directly. "The Vale line doesn't come from a border pack. Not originally. It comes from the Ashwolf bloodline, the old royal strain, pre-dynasty, pre-Thorn." The cold off the plateau pressed against her face. "That's not possible," she said. "My family would know." "Your family knows what the Thorn dynasty's historical revision left them knowing." His voice was even. Factual, the way he'd been factual all night. Not softened, not delivered with the cushion of apologetics, just laid out flat for her to look at. The old bloodlines were systematically stripped from the official records after the Consolidation Wars. Easier to rule people who don't know what they come from. She was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me this why?" she said. "Because if it's true, and my specialist is not wrong often, then you're not a political bargaining piece that was misused." A pause. "You're a sovereign bloodline that was suppressed, and that changes what you're capable of claiming." The wind off the plateau moved through the tree line behind them with a low structural sound. She felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, which felt too light and too easily punctured for what this was. Something more tectonic. The grinding of one plate against another before the landscape rearranges. "I want to see the records," she said. "They'll be here by nightfall. I sent for them this morning." She turned to look at him fully. He was watching her with those ice-water eyes, and the expression she was starting to understand was his baseline. Not closed off, just very still, the way water is still before something moves it. "Why are you doing this?" she said. Not the arrangement question. She understood the arrangement. The other thing. The records, the research, the 3 months of work before she arrived. "Because Draven Thorn is going to be a problem for the Northern Territories in the next 2 years," he said. "And the best tool against a king who stole power is a queen who was owed it." She held his gaze. And if I don't want to be a tool? A pause that was longer than his previous ones. Then you're something else. He said it like it was simple, which was how the things that aren't simple get said when the person saying them means them. The offer doesn't come with conditions on what you do with it. You take what's yours, you do what you decide to do with it. I'll back you either way. Why? Because the continent needs someone other than Draven Thorn making decisions about the Northern Territories. And you're the most qualified person I've found who also has a reason to be committed to it. He paused. And because what he did to you last night was a waste of something that didn't deserve to be wasted. The last sentence landed differently than the others, quieter, less official. She looked away from him, back at the Highlands. I'll look at the records, she said. Tonight. Good. They stood in the wind for another moment, the space between them unchanged. 2 feet, deliberate, neither closing it nor widening it. You should know, she said, that I'm not easy to manage. I'm not looking for something easy to manage. And I'm not going to spend the next phase of my life being grateful. I'd be suspicious of you if you were. She almost smiled. She didn't, but the shape of it passed through her face and she felt him register it in the slight adjustment of his own posture. Nightfall, she said, I'll read the records. I'll be there. She turned and walked back toward the camp, and the wind came off the plateau and lifted her hair back from her face, and something that had been crushed for 3 years, not hope, not ambition, something older and more structural than either, took its first real breath. She did not know yet what she was becoming, but the becoming had started. That evening, the records arrived by courier from Kael's eastern contact, 4 rolled leather cases sealed with plain wax, unmarked. They sat across the camp table from each other in the lamplight and went through them page by page, Kael reading alongside her not as a guide but as a parallel reader, and what she found inside those pages rearranged the geography of her own history so completely that she had to sit with it for several minutes between sections just to let each piece settle. The Vale bloodline, the Ashwolf strain, pre-dynasty records that the Thorn consolidation had buried under 3 generations of revised history. Her great-great-grandmother's name, listed in a territorial accord from 140 years ago, not as a pack lord's wife, but as a sovereign signatory in her own right. She signed it herself, Seraphine said. She wrote the terms, Kael said. Seraphine put the page down, picked up the next one, put it down again. He knew, she said. Very quiet. Draven knew this. Someone in that court knew this. It's why the match was made. Why it was considered significant enough to be worth 3 years of my life in that palace. They weren't giving him a Luna. They were neutralizing a bloodline. A silence. That's my read too, Kael said. She felt the shift happen in real time, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical quality that betrayal usually comes with in retrospect. Just a door closing on something she had been wrong about, and another door, the size of a continent, beginning very slowly to open. When I was 16, she said, and they sent me to the palace, my father held both my hands before I left. He said, "Remember who you come from." I thought it was just something you say. She picked up the page again. It wasn't just something you say, she said. The lamp on the left guttered. The oil was low. Kael reached over without looking and adjusted the wick without interrupting the silence, and she found this, the simple practical competence of it. The absence of any need to make the gesture mean something, oddly centering. She read until her eyes ached. When she finally set the last page down, the camp outside had gone to its night quiet, and the fire she could hear through the tent canvas had burned to its lower register, and Kael was still sitting across from her with the particular patience of someone who has learned that waiting is not the same as wasting time. I have a question, she said. Ask it. This changes what I'm worth to you. Strategically. A suppressed sovereign bloodline is a more significant asset than a politically displaced Luna. She held his gaze. Does it change the terms you offered? He looked at her for a moment. No, he said. Why not? Because I don't renegotiate from strength. He said it simply, the way he said everything, as if the concept of performing it hadn't occurred to him. I told you what I wanted before I knew this. I'm not going to tell you something different now that you have more leverage. That's not how I operate. She studied him. Most people do, though, she said. Most people operate from scarcity. He leaned back slightly in his chair, arms easy across his chest. They think there's not enough. Power, territory, advantage, so they grab and renegotiate when the balance shifts. I found that's a way of making enemies out of allies. A pause. I'd rather have the ally. The tent was quiet. I'll stay, she said. Not for him. Not for the alliance. Not for the records. Not for the strategic calculation of what she could build from the ruins of the worst night of her life. She said it for herself because staying was what made sense for the person she was going to become. And that person had just that evening found the first piece of evidence that she was more, had always been more, than anyone who had used her or discarded her had understood. On my terms, she added. On your terms, he said. She stood, picked up the leather case with the records, and held it. I'll want to talk to your research specialist tomorrow, she said, directly. I have questions she'll need to answer. She'll be available. And I'll want access to your full territorial intelligence on the Thorn Court, not summaries, the raw reports. Done. And, she paused, I'll need paper tonight, and a lamp. He looked at her. What for? I'm going to start writing down everything I know about the internal structure of Draven's court while it's still fresh. She held his eyes. Strategic intelligence degrades. You said yourself the Thorn Kingdom is a 2-year problem. I don't intend to waste the window. A pause. Then Kael Duskbane, alpha of the Black Wolf clan, the man the northern border lords woke sweating about, looked at the woman across his camp table, the woman who had walked into his tent 6 hours ago with nothing but a bone-handled knife, 2 changes of clothes, and a spine forged from something he was only beginning to understand the composition of. And he said, without calculation, without strategy, without anything other than the raw honesty of a response he hadn't planned, you're going to be a problem for a lot of people. She held his gaze. Good, she said. She took the paper. She took the lamp. She sat at the far edge of the tent with the lamp warm on her left side, and the cold of the night pressing at the canvas, and the sounds of the Black Wolf camp settling into its deep night rhythm all around her. And she began to write. She wrote Draven's name at the top of the first page, not with hatred, with precision. And in the palace 2 hours south, where the bond ceremony had ended, and the new queen was sleeping in sheets that had once been laid out for someone else, the man who had stood on that platform and made his choice was sitting alone in his study with a glass of something he wasn't tasting, staring at the northern window, experiencing the first symptoms of something he would not diagnose correctly for months. The specific structural unease of a person who has made an irreversible mistake and doesn't yet understand the full dimensions of what they've lost. He thought it was guilt. It wasn't guilt. It was the beginning of a reckoning, and the woman who was going to deliver it was 3 hours into a document that would become, in the months ahead, the most comprehensive intelligence map of his court ever assembled. Written from memory in a Black Wolf camp by lamplight by the woman he had thrown away in front of 10,000 witnesses. The lamp burned. The pen moved. She did not stop writing until dawn. 6 weeks into the Black Wolf camp, and Seraphine had filled 11 pages of intelligence documentation, learned 3 new combat forms from the clan's weapons master, and stopped flinching when Kael's wolves looked at her directly. Progress, by any functional measure. The document she had built was meticulous. Names, relationships, resource flows, the informal power structures that ran beneath the official ones like groundwater beneath stone, who actually controlled the treasury disbursements and who merely signed them. Which of Draven's council members were loyal to the man and which were loyal to the position, a distinction that mattered enormously when the position started to look unstable. The 3 border lords whose alliances were transactional and would flip the moment a better offer arrived. The 2 who wouldn't, and why, and what it would cost to neutralize them without direct confrontation. She knew this material the way you know the interior of a house you've lived in for years. Not because you cataloged it deliberately, but because you were there paying attention, for long enough that the structure of it became part of your own structure. Kael had read every page. He read without commenting extensively, which she had come to understand was his version of approval. He pushed back hard on things he disagreed with, and when he didn't push back, the work was solid. The Haas assessment, he'd said, on the 3rd week, tapping a page with one finger. What about it? You're certain he'd break if Celine's influence became politically toxic. Hass has served 3 kings. He serves the dynasty, not the person wearing it. The moment the person wearing it becomes a liability to the dynasty's stability, he transfers his loyalty to whoever stabilizes it. She had met Kael's eyes across the table. He won't like me, but he'll work with me. A pause. You're not angry at him. He did what men like him do. I'd rather understand it than be angry at it. Kael had looked at her for a moment with something in his expression she couldn't fully decode yet. Not admiration exactly, something more like recognition. The look of a person who has operated a certain way in isolation and then encounters someone who operates the same way and feels the specific, slightly startling quality of being seen. She had filed that look, examined it at night when the camp was quiet. Put it away. There were more pressing things. The pressing thing on the morning the 37th day broke over the highlands was a courier from the Eastern Territories who arrived before dawn with his horse in bad condition and his face worse, and went directly to Kael's tent without stopping at the perimeter checkpoint the way couriers were supposed to. Seraphine was already awake. She heard the horse, heard the break in protocol, and was out of her tent and moving before the rational part of her brain had constructed a reason why. She got to Kael's tent as he was coming out of it, already dressed, already carrying the particular quality of stillness he wore when something had shifted and he was processing the new geometry of it. Behind him, the courier was visible through the open flap, sitting on the ground with a tin of water, looking like a man who had ridden through the night and arrived with something that cost him to carry. Kael looked at her when she appeared. Didn't tell her to go back to bed. Get dressed for travel, he said. We have a problem. What kind? The kind that means your document isn't theoretical anymore. A pause. Draven's moving troops to the northern border. She stood very still. How many? 400 to start. The eastern crossing. His voice was flat and controlled. It's not an invasion posture. It's a pressure posture. He's pushing toward the Highland Territory to establish a claim before the Continental Summit in 2 months. The Continental Summit. She had known it was coming. It was the kind of event the continent organized every decade when the balance of power had shifted enough that everyone needed to be in the same room simultaneously to recalibrate. Every major pack and territory would send representation. Treaties would be negotiated or broken. The political map of the next 10 years would take its shape there. She had been planning for it. From her position in the Black Wolf camp, building toward it as a controlled moment, a context in which she could reappear not as a political casualty, but as a figure with her own standing. 400 troops on the eastern crossing changed the timeline. He's trying to establish territorial precedent before the summit, she said. If he can plant flags in the Highland buffer zone before it convenes, he walks into that room with a fait accompli. Kael's eyes were on hers with the focused quality of someone talking through a problem to someone he trusts to think it through with him. Nobody's going to give up territory they already physically hold just because a summit table said to. He knows that. He knows that. She breathed once, slowly. The morning was cold and gray, and the camp was starting to move around them, wolves registering the energy of the situation without knowing its content yet, the way a pack does, adjusting, preparing, waiting for the shape of the threat to become clear. This wasn't his idea, she said. Kael's eyes sharpened fractionally. Why? Because Draven doesn't move troops in political gestures. He moves them when he intends to fight. 400 to the eastern crossing is a number designed to look aggressive without committing to actual engagement. It's a diplomatic maneuver dressed in military clothes. She looked at him directly. Someone counseled him to this. Someone who understands the summit politics well enough to calculate the minimum force for maximum positional gain. A silence. Celine, Kael said, or someone behind her. She felt something cold move through her that wasn't the morning air. Her father controls 3 coastal pack lords who have been trying to get a foothold in the Highland buffer zone for 15 years. If Draven claims it before the summit and she's his queen, the Crestfall Coast gets a land corridor they've wanted since before I was born. Kael was looking at her with the expression of someone running their own parallel calculation and watching the numbers land in the same place. She's not just his mistress, he said slowly. She was never just his mistress. The cold thing in Seraphine's chest settled into something hard and functional. She's her father's agent. She's been Lord Crestfall's agent this whole time. positioned in that court for one specific purpose, securing the Highland Corridor. Draven was the mechanism. The bond ceremony wasn't about desire. Her voice came out very even. It was about land. Kael stood in the gray morning light and processed this in the way she'd come to recognize. Completely still on the outside, deeply active on the inside. The kind of thinking that happened in a person whose mind had been trained to process threat as a structural problem rather than an emotional event. If that's true, he said finally, then Draven doesn't know it. Almost certainly not. And when he finds out, if he finds out, she held his gaze. Men like Draven don't find out things about the people they chose unless the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. They've already made the choice. They've already paid the cost of it publicly, so the architecture of their thinking is built around the choice being correct. A pause. He'll be the last person in that palace to see it. Kael studied her for a moment. Something passed through his expression that was gone before she could name it. Get dressed, he said again. We're riding to the Eastern Scout Post. I want eyes on that troop movement before I make any decisions. She was ready in 10 minutes. They rode hard through the highland terrain with 6 of Kael's wolves flanking. The kind of riding that meant business, not travel, the specific pace that covered ground without announcing itself. Seraphine rode like she'd been riding since she was 8 years old on Vale Mountain trails that made these highland paths look considered, and she watched Kael's posture in the saddle the way she'd taken to watching him generally. Cataloging, understanding the language of him, the way he communicated in physical terms what he wasn't saying out loud. He was angry. She could read it in the set of his shoulders, the particular economy of his movement. Not hot anger, nothing about Kael ran hot. Cold anger, the kind that didn't spend itself uselessly but went somewhere, was directed toward something, became structural. She was angry too. She noted the shape of her own anger with the detached interest of someone observing a new weather system moving in. This was not the devastating paralytic grief of the bond ceremony night. This was different, sharper, more purposeful. The anger of a person who has been given information that clarifies rather than obscures. They reached the Eastern Scout Post as the sun came over the highland ridge and threw long, cold light across the territory below them. The Scout Post was a natural rock formation with a prepared observation platform cut into its upper level, invisible from below, with sight lines across 4 miles of the buffer zone territory. What she saw from that platform rearranged her timeline entirely. It wasn't 400 troops. It was 400 troops in a supply train, and supply trains didn't accompany pressure postures. Supply trains accompanied intent to hold. He's not establishing a claim, she said, quietly. More to herself than to Kael. Kael was looking through the field scope beside her, his jaw set hard. No, he's building a forward position. She looked at the supply train below. The scale of it, the organization, the specific logistics of what you brought when you weren't planning to leave. He's going to be dug in before the summit convenes. He's going to arrive at that table already in possession. Kael lowered the scope. He looked at her. How long do we have? She said. At that pace? 3 weeks before they're established enough that removing them requires a level of force that makes us the aggressor at the summit. 3 weeks. She had been planning for 2 months. 2 months to build her position, establish her legitimacy through the bloodline documentation, arrive at the summit with standing and allies, and a story that had had time to settle into the political consciousness of the continent. 2 months to become something that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. 3 weeks was a different problem entirely. I need to send a message, she said. Kael looked at her. To who? Hass? A silence. She felt him processing it, the complexity of what she was suggesting, the risk of it, the specific gamble of reaching back into the palace through a channel that could expose her location, her alliance, her entire rebuilt position to people who might not keep the information contained. You trust him that far, he said. I trust that his interests and mine align on this specific point. She held his gaze. If Celine's father gets the Highland Corridor, the Crestfall Coast controls access to the northern trade routes. That affects every packed territory on the continent, including the ones Hass has spent 40 years balancing against each other. He will not want that outcome. And if he takes your message to Draven, then Draven knows I am alive, I'm here, and I have intelligence about his new queen's actual loyalties. She let that sit for a moment. That's not necessarily the worst outcome. Kael's expression did something complicated. He looked out over the buffer zone, at the tiny, precise movements of 400 wolves in their supply train below, at the territory being quietly claimed in real time while the continent prepared for a conversation about the rules. "Write the message here," he said finally. "I'll have it couriered through 3 relays, so the origin point is untraceable." "I know." He looked at her. "You'd already thought of the relay system." "I'd already thought of most of this," she said. The timeline just moved up. Something shifted in his expression, that recognition quality again, the slight recalibration of a person updating their model of who they're dealing with. She had been doing this to him regularly for 6 weeks, and she noticed each time because each time it was followed by him treating her fractionally differently. Not with more deference. Nothing about Kael operated on deference, but with more of the particular quality of attention he gave things he considered genuinely significant. She noticed it. She kept noticing it. She kept putting it away. They rode back to camp in a different silence than the one they'd ridden out in. Heavier, more textured, carrying the weight of a situation that had moved from preparation to urgency. The camp read the shift in them the moment they came through the perimeter and adjusted without being told, the way a well-run operation does when it trusts its leadership enough to let the energy of incoming information move through it naturally. Seraphine went directly to her tent, sat at her small writing surface, and wrote the most precisely calculated 40 words of her life. She didn't sign it with her name. She signed it with a reference that only Haas would decode, a specific phrase from a particular council session in her second year at the palace, something that had passed between them in a corridor, a moment so minor that no one watching would have catalogued it. Haas would know it was her. No one else would. She handed it to Kael's courier relay and did not watch it go. She went back to the intelligence document and added everything she now knew about the Highland troop movement, the supply train, the Crestfall corridor strategy. She updated her assessment of Celine from operative adjacent to primary operative. She revised her estimate of the summit's power dynamics with the new variables. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. It was the handler. She had learned his actual name was Torin by the 3rd week, but still thought of him as the handler, who came to her tent at the end of the 4th hour. He knocked on the tent post. She looked up. His face told her something had gone wrong before he opened his mouth. "Message came back," he said. She set her pen down. Haas responded. "Not Haas." Torin's jaw was tight. The courier on the second relay, before the message reached Haas. Something cold and structural moved through her. Intercepted. "We don't know that yet." The courier broke protocol. Came back instead of completing the relay. Said he got spooked by unusual movement near the palace's southern approach. Torin's eyes were careful on hers. Could be nothing. Could be they're tracking outgoing messages, and he read the surveillance correctly and made the right call. Or, she said, or someone on the relay chain told someone they shouldn't have told. She was quiet for a moment, running it. The relay chain had 3 points. Kael had built it himself, using wolves he'd trusted for years. She believed that trust was warranted. She had no evidence against it, and Kael's judgment in these matters was not the judgment of someone who made careless choices. But the message hadn't reached Haas. An unusual movement near the palace's southern approach was the kind of detail that could mean surveillance or could mean coincidence. And the cost of assuming coincidence when it was actually surveillance was significantly higher than the cost of assuming surveillance when it was coincidence. "Where is Kael?" she said. "War room." She stood. The war room was what the camp called the large tent at its center that held the full map tables. Not just the Highland territories, but the full continental spread, marked with stones and pins, and the kind of information that took years and significant resources to compile. Kael was there with 3 of his senior wolves, standing over the Highland section, speaking in low voices that stopped when she came in. He looked at her, read her face. "You heard," he said. "Torin told me." He dismissed the 3 wolves with a look. They left without hesitation. She and Kael stood across the map table from each other in a tent that suddenly felt significantly smaller. "It's a leak," she said. "I don't know that yet." "You think it's a leak?" A pause. His jaw worked slightly. "I think it's possible." "Who knew about the relay chain?" 8 people. All of them my wolves. All of them people I've operated with for years. He said it with the precise control of someone keeping a reaction compressed because the situation doesn't allow for the reaction yet. That doesn't make them above compromise. She thought about what it cost a man who operated on loyalty as a structural principle to say that sentence out loud. The kind of loyalty Kael built and kept was not casual. It was the loyalty of a shared history, of people who had bled in the same directions together. Acknowledging that it might have fractures meant acknowledging something about the world that he would rather not acknowledge. She understood that feeling from the inside. Draven has resources I don't, she said. If he's been looking for me, and I should have assumed he'd be looking, the rejected Luna disappearing entirely is a political problem he can't leave unresolved. Then he has people searching the northern territories, bribing, threatening, working the network. Someone along that relay chain may not have broken voluntarily. Kael's eyes met hers. That's a generous read. It's a practical read. If someone was compromised by pressure rather than choice, that's a different kind of problem than if someone sold us out deliberately. The response to it is different. A silence. Either way, she said, they know the message went north. They may not know where it went or who it went to, but they know I'm alive and I'm trying to reach the palace. Which means they know you're a variable. They always knew I was a variable. They just didn't know where I was on the board. She looked down at the map. The Highland Buffer Zone, the palace 2 hours south of the Black Wolf territory, the Eastern Crossing with its 400 wolves and their supply train. The summit, 2 months away. No, 6 weeks now. They'd lose 2 weeks to the accelerated situation. Draven is going to come north personally. Kael went very still. I know how he thinks, she said. He doesn't send people to resolve things that threaten his position. He goes himself. He considers that a strength. She paused. He'll come north under the pretext of inspecting the troop deployment. He'll actually be looking for me. And when he finds you here, it changes everything about how the summit plays. She pushed off from the table and turned away from it, moved to the tent's entrance. The camp was outside, functional and real. The smell of cook fires, the sound of wolves training in the western clearing, the mundane working rhythm of 100 people who had no idea that the situation had just shifted under them. He won't come to negotiate. He'll come to reassert control. He'll see the Black Wolf Alliance as a threat to his position, and he'll try to cut it off at the source. She turned back. He'll try to take me back, she said. The sentence landed in the tent like a stone in water, and the ripples of it reached Kael, and she watched them arrive in his face. Not shock. Nothing about Kael was shock, but something colder and more immediate than his usual processing quality. Something that was almost personal. He won't succeed, Kael said. I know he won't. She held his gaze. But the attempt itself is a crisis. The moment he rides into Black Wolf territory and makes a claim on a woman living under your protection, you either defend that or you lose every alliance that's contingent on your pack's reputation for keeping what it holds. She paused. And I lose the 6 weeks I needed to build enough standing to walk into the summit on my own terms. Kael was looking at her with the ice-water eyes at their most unreadable, and for once she couldn't find the bottom of what was in them. So we moved the timeline, he said. We moved the timeline. How? She looked at him. 6 weeks ago she had walked into this tent with nothing. She had rebuilt herself inside these walls with 7 hours of lamplight and 11 pages of documentation and a Black Wolf token she still kept in the inside pocket of her traveling jacket because she was not ready to examine why she kept it. She was not the woman who had stood in that corridor entrance waiting to walk into a hall that was about to destroy her. She was something less finished than what she intended to become, but she was already something genuinely different from what she had been, and the difference had teeth. I need to be at the summit not as a claimant, she said, not as a political problem that needs to be resolved. I need to walk into that room as someone who has already made decisions that the rest of them are going to have to respond to. She kept her voice even and let the words carry the weight of what she meant without decoration. I need to not be asking for anything. I need to be someone who has already moved. Kael was quiet. The bloodline documentation, she said. Can your specialist authenticate it in 6 weeks? 4 if we push. 4. And the Highland troop movement, Xie. If Draven is coming north, he's pulling attention away from his southern border alliances. Which of those lords would flip if they believed the Thorn position was weakening? He didn't hesitate. Aldrich of the South Pass. He's been hedging for 2 years. Get me a meeting with Aldrich before Draven arrives. That's 2 weeks. Then we move in 2 weeks. She looked at him fully, the whole weight of what she was saying given directly, without softening. I'm not going to wait for him to come here and turn this into his confrontation on his terms. I'm going to be already in motion when he arrives. I'm going to be something he has to chase rather than something he has to find. The tent was quiet. Outside, the camp worked on. The fires burned. The highland wind moved through the territory in long, cold currents. Cale Duskbane looked at the woman across his map table, the woman who had arrived with a bone-handled knife and a spine. He was still, 6 weeks later, finding the full dimensions of, and he made a decision. She could see it happen in real time, the way his decisions always happened, not gradually, but all at once, like a weight released. I'll ride to Aldrich myself, he said. Tomorrow. I'm coming with you. A pause. It'll be faster it'll be more effective with me. She held his gaze without apology. Aldrich needs to see me. He needs to see me beside you, not represented by you. There's a difference between Kyle Duskbane telling a border lord that the Thorn dynasty is losing the loyalty of a sovereign bloodline, and that sovereign bloodline sitting across the table and telling him herself. Another pause. Longer. You're right, he said. Simply. She nodded once. She went back to her tent and packed for travel without ceremony. The things she needed and nothing she didn't. The economy of someone who had learned in the past 6 weeks that weight was a liability and speed was a resource. The Black Wolf token went into the inside pocket of her jacket, where it lived. She was sitting on her bedroll looking at the intelligence document, all 11 pages of it, the architecture of everything she knew about the court she'd been thrown out of, when the thought arrived clearly and without drama, the way thoughts arrive when the mind has been building toward them quietly for longer than you realized. She was not going back to fix what had happened. She was not going back to reclaim what was taken. She was going forward, towards something that hadn't existed before, something she was building in real time from the materials of her own wreckage. The woman who had stood in that corridor entrance 6 weeks ago had believed, somewhere deep and unexamined, that she needed someone to choose her, needed to be selected, validated, placed on a platform by someone with the authority to decide she was worth it. That woman was gone. What was walking toward Lord Aldrich's territory tomorrow morning, beside the most feared alpha on the continent, with 11 pages of intelligence and an authenticated bloodline claim, and the specific calibrated fury of someone who had been underestimated by every room she'd ever walked into? That was something else entirely. Something that had not existed before the worst night of her life. And somewhere south, in a palace already beginning to fracture at its foundations, Draven Thorn was preparing to ride north to reclaim something. He was going to discover, when he arrived, that it wasn't there anymore. She wasn't the thing he'd lost. She was the thing coming for him, and she was already in motion. The meeting with Lord Aldrich of the South Pass took 4 hours and produced 3 things: a signed territorial neutrality agreement, a promise of summit abstention from the Thorn bloc, and the particular expression of a man who had spent 20 years watching the political landscape of the continent from a careful, survivable distance, suddenly recalculating every assumption he'd built that distance on. Seraphine had spoken for 40 minutes of those 4 hours. Aldrich had looked at her the way men of his generation looked at things that surprised them, with the instinctive resistance of someone whose mental categories were being revised against their preference, followed by the grudging recalibration of someone who was, underneath the resistance, genuinely intelligent. The bloodline documentation, he'd said near the end. You'd make this available to the summit. I'd make it central to the summit, she'd said. Every pack lord in that room deserves to know what the Thorn dynasty buried. A silence. Aldrich had looked at Kyle. Kale had said nothing, which was the most effective thing he could have said. I'll want independent verification, Aldrich said finally. I expected that. I have 3 sources. Your own historian can review them. He had signed the agreement 40 minutes later with the resigned efficiency of a man closing a door on a version of the future he'd been planning for. They rode back through the highland terrain in the dark with Torin and 5 wolves flanking, and the silence between her and Kyle had the particular texture of a silence that contained something neither person is ready to say yet, weighted, aware of itself, moving around the unsaid thing the way water moves around stone. It was Kyle who broke it. 2 more lords like Aldrich, he said, and Draven walks into the summit with no block. 1 more. she said. Aldrich will talk to Marin of the Eastern Ridge before the summit. They've been aligned for 15 years and he won't be comfortable holding a position Marin doesn't share. She paused. Marin will come to us. A pause from Kyle. You knew that before we rode to Aldrich. Yes. You were always targeting Marin through him. Yes. The horses moved through the dark Highland Trail. Above them, the stars burned in their aggressive northern clarity. Somewhere to the west, a ridge wolf was marking territory. The long, structured sound of it carrying across the cold air with the kind of authority that doesn't require an audience. Seraphine, Kyle said. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead, his profile visible against the star dim, the line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders carrying the quality she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, deliberate stillness over something moving underneath. When this is done, he said, stopped, started again. When the summit is done and the bloodline claim is established, the outrider coming from the north hit them at full gallop before he finished the sentence. The horse was running hard and wrong, the gait of an animal that had been pushed beyond comfortable pace and kept going, and the wolf on its back was shouting before he was fully in earshot, a sound that cut through the night air and landed in Seraphine's chest like a stone dropped from height. Alpha, Palace troops, main camp, they're at the perimeter. Kale was already moving. His horse turned in a single motion, and he was riding back the way they'd come before Seraphine had fully processed the words. She followed without thinking. The decision not made consciously, but executed by something faster and more basic than conscious thought. They rode back in under 12 minutes at a pace that should have taken 20, and the camp they arrived to was not the camp they had left. The fires were wrong. Too many, too high, placed in patterns that spoke of confrontation rather than function. And at the camp's main entrance, in the torchlight of what had been the perimeter boundary, was a line of dark armored wolves bearing the Thorn dynasty's iron crest. Not the 400 from the eastern crossing, a smaller force, personal guard quality. 40, maybe 50. And in front of them, on a dark horse, he rode the way he wore power, as though the option of it being otherwise had never occurred to him, was Draven Thorn. He had come himself. She had predicted it. The prediction landing in reality still hit her like the flat of a blade. Kale's wolves had formed their own line inside the camp perimeter, facing out, controlled, armed, none of them moving because Kyle hadn't told them to move. The specific discipline of a pack that trusted its alpha enough to hold under pressure was visible in every line of every body, the compressed readiness of people who were not afraid but were not careless either. Kyle rode to his line and stopped. Seraphine pulled up beside him. Across 30 feet of cold highland air, Draven Thorn's gray eyes found her. She had thought about this moment, had known it was coming, had built her whole accelerated timeline around the certainty of it, and had told herself that preparation was the same as readiness. She understood now, with her heart doing something percussive and irregular in her chest and the cold sweat of the hard ride cooling against her spine, that preparation and readiness were related but not identical. He looked the same. That was the part that was hard in a way she hadn't anticipated. That 3 years had not changed the architecture of him, that the face she had spent a long time learning was still the same face, still carrying the same contradictions she had once believed she was the only person who could read. He was looking at her like a man who has ridden through the night and arrived somewhere he cannot categorize and is refusing to show how much that costs him. Seraphine, he said, just that. Her name, in that voice, with the full hall-carrying quality of it compressed down to the scale of 30 feet. It landed differently at this scale, more personal. She had not missed the way it landed, and she hated that she noticed. Draven, she said. His eyes moved to Kyle. Something happened in them, fast, controlled, the specific adjustment of a man recalibrating a threat assessment in real time. Kyle met the look without moving, without expression, with the absolute zero of a person who has nothing to prove and therefore needs no performance of it. You'll want to step back from my camp's perimeter, Kyle said. Quiet. The particular quiet of a voice that doesn't need volume because it has never needed volume. I'll step back when I've said what I came to say. Draven's jaw was set in the way she knew, not aggression, calculation. He was managing something. She could see the management happening in real time, and behind it, glimpsed in the pressure around his eyes, something raw that the management hadn't fully covered. "This doesn't concern you, Duskbane." "She's under my protection," Kael said. "That makes it concern me." "She's a Luna of the Thorn Dynasty." "Former," Seraphine said, clearly, without heat. Draven's eyes came back to her. The raw thing behind the management moved closer to the surface. "You left. You gave me nothing to stay for." "That's not—" He stopped. Something moved through his expression. The aborted syntax of a man whose prepared version of this conversation was not surviving contact with the actual one. "There are things you don't know. About that night. About why." "I know about Crestfall," she said. Silence. Not just from Draven, from the entire 30 feet of cold air between the two lines. From the wolves on both sides who were tracking this with the full attention of people who understood that what was happening in this register was more dangerous than what would happen if the swords came out. Draven's face had gone very still. "Say that again," he said. "Celine's father has been positioning for the Highland Corridor for 15 years. She kept her voice even and let the information carry its own weight. She was placed in your court as his agent. The bond you declared in front of 10,000 wolves was a land deal, Draven. You just didn't know you were the mechanism." The stillness on his face deepened into something else. She had seen him process information before, had watched him in council sessions when reports arrived that changed the geometry of a problem, and she recognized this particular quality of processing, the way it looked from the outside like nothing was happening while something enormous reorganized itself inside. "That's not possible," he said. The words came out with less certainty than his voice usually carried, much less. "The troop deployment to the Eastern Crossing," she said. 400 wolves and a supply train. You told them to establish a claim position before the summit. Standard pre-summit positioning. You sent a supply train." She held his gaze. "You don't send supply trains to claim positions. You send them to positions you intend to hold. Draven." The use of his name was deliberate, direct, carrying exactly the weight she put into it. Not intimacy, not the echo of what had been, but the specific authority of someone who knew him well enough to cut through the performance. "Someone told you to send that supply train. Think about who it was." His jaw worked. She watched him think. Watched the pieces land in the order they needed to land, watched the architecture of a belief he had built his last 3 months around begin to take on cracks he couldn't ignore because she was standing here telling him exactly where to look. This was not revenge. She had examined that question carefully enough to know the difference. Revenge required that his pain be the point, and his pain was not the point. The point was the summit, the Highland Corridor, the continent's next 10 years. His pain was a side effect of accurate information, and she was not responsible for managing it. She had stopped managing things that weren't hers to manage. "You need to pull those troops back," she said, "before the summit. If Crestfall gets that corridor through your name on a territorial claim, there is no political recovery from it. Not for you, not for the dynasty." Draven looked at her for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this?" he said. Low, very low, in the register he used when something was costing him, and he had decided to let it show to one person while showing nothing to anyone else. "Because the continent still needs a functional northern territory," she said. "And because whatever you did to me in that hall, I'm not interested in burning everything you built just because you burned what I was building." She paused. "This isn't mercy. It's math." Something passed through his face that she identified and then immediately refused to let mean anything. He looked like a man standing in the ruins of something he built himself and understanding for the first time the full dimensions of what he'd broken. "Come back," he said. The camp was completely silent. She felt Kael, to her left, go very still. Not the operational stillness of threat assessment, but something else. The stillness of a person holding something very carefully. "No," she said. "Seraphine, no." She kept her voice level and let the word be complete. Not angry, not grieving, not performing the strength of it. Just the word, holding the full weight of its own finality. "There is no version of that. Not because of what you did. I've made my peace with what you did, and that's not something I expect you to understand tonight. But because the person you'd be asking to come back doesn't exist anymore." She held his gaze directly. I'm not the Luna you discarded, Draven. That woman is gone. She didn't survive what you did to her. What I am now—" She paused, not for effect, but because the next words needed to be exact. "Is not something you made. It's something I made. And it's not yours." The gray eyes were doing something she had no language for and didn't need language for because she was no longer in the business of translating him. "Duskbane Masin," Draven's voice shifted, not louder, but harder. The outer layer of management replaced with something more direct. "What is she to you?" Kale's response came without hesitation and without temperature. "Everything you didn't understand she could be." The 5 words landed in the night air with the specific quality of something that cannot be taken back. Seraphine felt her breath change, felt something in her chest move toward a thing she had been carefully, deliberately not naming for 6 weeks, because naming it would require her to examine it, and examining it was not something she was prepared to do, while she was also rebuilding her entire existence from scratch. She was looking at the map. She needed to be looking at the map. Draven's face had done something complicated and then locked down completely. The full stone of his public expression, all the cracks covered, everything internal made invisible. When he spoke again, his voice carried the formal quality of a man returning to a role because the alternative is too costly to be in front of witnesses. "The summit," he said. "I'll hear your bloodline claim at the summit." "You'll do more than hear it," she said. "You'll acknowledge it." A pause so long it had weight. "I'll review the documentation," he said. It wasn't what she'd demanded. It was the first concession of a man who was not yet ready to give the full thing, but was no longer able to hold the full denial. She could work with it. She had always been good at working with the first crack in a wall. "Pull your troops back from the eastern crossing," she said. "All of them, before you reach the palace." "That's before you reach the palace, Draven, or I present the Crestfall intelligence to every pack lord attending the summit, and you walk into that room already finished." His jaw was stone. His eyes were something else entirely. He turned his horse. His guard turned with them. The practiced unison of men who had been doing this for years. And the line of dark-armored wolves began to move back the way they'd come, south through the highland dark, taking their torchlight with them in diminishing increments until the camp's own fires were the only illumination left, and the sound of 50 horses was a receding percussion in the cold air. Seraphine watched them go. She was aware of her own heartbeat, aware of the sweat cooling at her hairline, aware of the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a person who has been running at maximum internal load for a sustained period and has just spent the last 20 minutes doing something that cost more than she had budgeted for. She was also aware of Kael, still to her left, not touching her, not speaking, just there in the complete and uncomplicated way he was always there. Without condition, without agenda, without the particular weight of a person who needs something from you in return for their presence. She had known people who stayed beside you. She had not known many who stayed the way he stayed. "You should go inside," he said finally. "Quiet." In a minute, she looked at the space where Draven's line had been, at the dark highland terrain beyond it, at the stars, at the distance. Everything she had planned for the summit was still in motion. The bloodline documentation, Aldrich's signature, the intelligence on Crestfall. The pieces were where she had placed them. Draven's first concession was not the full acknowledgement, but it was a crack. And cracks were how light got in and how walls came down, and she knew how to work a crack. The summit was 6 weeks away. She had 6 weeks to make herself undeniable. She reached into her jacket and felt the Black Wolf token in the inside pocket. Worn smooth from handling, she left it where it was. "What you said to him," she said, not looking at Kael, eyes still on the dark. "About what I am to you." A pause. "I meant it," he said. She breathed. "I know," she said. She still didn't look at him. She wasn't ready to look at him. Because looking at him, right now, after this night, with the walls she'd been building starting to develop their own particular cracks from the inside, looking at him would require her to acknowledge something she had been calling strategy and tactical investment and functional partnership and every other word that wasn't the actual word. She wasn't ready for the actual word. She turned and walked back into the camp. He fell into step beside her, 2 feet of air between them, unchanged. And the 6 weeks that followed were the most consequential of her life, full of documentation reviews and border lord meetings and intelligence analysis, and the slow, grinding work of building a position that couldn't be dismissed or managed or strategically absorbed. She learned 3 more combat forms. She slept 4 hours a night and felt it. She argued with Kyle twice about summit strategy with a ferocity that left both of them sharpened rather than damaged, which she filed away because it was the first time in her adult life she had argued with someone and come out of it feeling better rather than smaller. The bloodline claim was authenticated by 2 independent historians on the 41st day. Marin of the Eastern Ridge sent his abstention notice to the Thorn Court on the 46th day, which meant Aldrich had talked to him exactly when she predicted. On the 51st day, a letter arrived from Chancellor Haas, routed through 3 relays, delayed 3 weeks by the compromised courier situation, but arrived, consisting of 4 sentences that confirmed he had received her original message, that the Crestfall intelligence was being reviewed internally, and that he looked forward to the possibility of speaking at the summit. 4 sentences. From Haas. That was a novel. On the 54th day, 4 days before the Continental Summit convened, they broke camp and rode south. 120 Black Wolf wolves in traveling formation carrying the Black Wolf standard at the front of the column. Seraphine rode at the center of the formation in traveling clothes she had broken in over 6 weeks of Highland riding. Dark, functional, carrying nothing decorative except the silver pin at her collar that bore the Ashwolf mark from the bloodline documentation. A choice that was not decorative at all. Cale rode beside her. 3 hours into the ride, as the terrain shifted from highland to lower foothills and the scale of the world opened up around them, she looked at him and found him already looking at her. "How do you feel?" he said. She considered the question with the honest attention it deserved. "Like myself," she said, for the first time in a very long time. Something moved through his face. Not the recognition quality this time. Something warmer and more specific. He looked at her the way the camp looked at him when he walked into it, like something to orient by, like north. She held that look for exactly as long as she could before the practical part of her brain reminded her where they were going, and why and what the next 4 days required. "We need to talk about the summit opening," she said. "We do," he agreed, and the almost smile in his voice was something she chose to hear and then chose not to respond to, because they were 4 days out from the most important room she had ever walked into, and she needed everything she had for what was coming. The column rode south. The summit was 4 days away. Every pack lord of significance on the continent was converging on the central hall from different directions. The eastern reaches, the lowlands, the coastal packs, the mountain territories, the border lords who had spent 20 years keeping their heads down and their options open. They were coming to negotiate the next decade. They were coming to confirm alliances and break the ones they'd outgrown and establish new positions in a landscape that had been shifting since before the bond ceremony that started all of this. They had no idea what was walking toward them. On the morning of the 4th day, as the column crested the last highland ridge before the descent into the Central Territories, the summit hall was visible below, enormous, ancient, built in the era before any current dynasty existed, surrounded by the standards of 20 packs already planted in the ground around its perimeter. Seraphine reined in at the ridge top and looked at it. Cale stopped beside her. Below them, working his way toward the hall from the southern approach, was a column bearing the thorn iron crest. She could see it at this distance, the dark armor, the organized lines, the particular precision of a royal procession. Draven had brought 300. She had 120. The authenticated bloodline documentation, Aldrich's signature, Marin's abstention, Haas's 4 sentences, and 6 weeks of transformation that had occurred in the particular crucible that only exists when everything you thought was permanent turns out to be negotiable. She looked at the hall below. She looked at Kyle. He was watching her with those ice-water eyes and the expression she had finally, over 54 days of close proximity, decoded completely. Not because it had changed, but because she had finally stopped looking for what she expected to find and started seeing what was actually there. "Ready," he said. Not a question. She straightened in the saddle. "I've been ready," she said, "since the night he made me leave." She touched her heels to her horse. The column moved down the ridge toward the hall where everything was about to change. toward the room where the continent's next decade would be written, toward the confrontation that had been building since a silver-gowned woman stood 40 feet from a platform and understood in real time that the life she had built was being dismantled in front of witnesses. Below them, Draven's column had stopped moving. Someone in it had seen the Black Wolf standard on the ridge. She could see, even at this distance, the particular quality of stillness that moved through his procession, the specific paralysis of people who have been expecting one version of the world and have just encountered evidence that a different version has been building without their knowledge. She rode toward it without slowing. Whatever happened inside that hall in the next 4 days, whatever confrontations, whatever revelations, whatever the full cost of Celine's exposed deception turned out to be, it would happen to a woman who had walked into the worst night of her life and come out of it carrying something that couldn't be taken back. The summit doors were 200 yards away. Draven had seen her now. She was certain of it. The thorn column had reformed and resumed its approach, but the energy of it had changed. She could read it from the ridge. The difference between a procession that knows what it's walking toward and one that is suddenly, urgently recalculating. She did not slow down. 100 yards. Kael was at her left shoulder, steady, carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had made his position clear and saw no reason to revisit it. 50 yards. The summit hall doors opened, the ceremonial opening scheduled, the herald's announcement audible even at this distance, and the gathered pack lords turned to see who was entering first. What they saw was a woman in traveling clothes with a silver ash wolf pin at her collar and a black wolf alpha at her shoulder and 120 wolves behind her, riding down from the highland ridge with the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has already made every decision that matters. And Draven Thorn, pulling his horse to a stop 20 yards from the summit entrance, looking at her across the distance with those gray eyes that she had spent years learning to read and had finally, fully, permanently stopped needing to, looking at her like a man who has just understood too late that the thing he threw away was not what he thought it was. She looked back once, then she rode through the doors. The Continental Summit Hall smelled of old stone and newer ambition, the particular combination of a building that had outlasted every political arrangement ever negotiated inside it, and would outlast this one too. Seraphine walked in first. The gathered pack lords turned as she entered. 23 representatives from territories spanning the full breadth of the continent, standing in the pre-session configuration that meant everyone was still positioning, still reading the room, still deciding where to stand before they had to commit to a seat. She watched their faces do what faces do when a variable they hadn't calculated for walks through a door. The sequence of recognition, reassessment, and the very fast internal accounting of what her presence meant for whatever position they'd arrived planning to hold. She gave them time to look. She had dressed for this, not in the silver ceremonial gown of a Luna presenting herself for selection, in the charcoal and deep gray of the ash wolf bloodline colors that the documentation had identified, with the silver pin at her collar that had ceased to be a symbol and become a statement. Practical clothes for an impractical room. The kind of clothes that said she had ridden here from somewhere real. Kael came in behind her, and behind him the Black Wolf delegation took their positions along the eastern wall with the quiet precision of people who occupied space rather than decorated it. Lord Aldrich was already seated at the main table. He met her eyes briefly when she entered and then looked deliberately away, which was Aldrich's version of acknowledgement. Chancellor Haas was standing near the northern wall in conversation with 2 border lords she recognized from her years in the palace. He saw her. His expression performed no particular reaction, which from Haas was the loudest possible signal of a prepared response. She was crossing toward the main table when Draven came through the doors. The room reconfigured itself immediately. Not dramatically, but the way a room reconfigures when a figure of primary significance enters, and every other figure adjusts its orientation in response. 20 years of being King Alpha had that effect on spaces, and she had watched it happen enough times to read the specific texture of it. He came in with 6 of his personal guard and stopped just inside the entrance. His eyes found her immediately. They always had. That had been one of the first things she noticed about him, years ago, that in any room he entered his eyes found her before they settled anywhere else, a habit she had once interpreted as something it wasn't. She was already seated by the time he reached the table. He sat across from her. Not beside. Across. The geometry of it was exact and deliberate and communicated everything that needed to be communicated before anyone spoke. Haas opened the summit with the formal language of 40 years of procedural practice, territorial declarations, attendance confirmation, the agenda structure that gave everyone a framework to fight inside. Seraphine listened and mapped the room simultaneously, watching alliances confirm and tentative ones reveal themselves in where people's eyes went during the opening statements. When the formal declarations concluded, Haas looked up from his documents. "The matter of the Ashwolf bloodline claim," he said, "has been submitted for summit consideration by Seraphine Vale of the Vale Mountain Pack, formerly designated Luna of the Thorn Dynasty." He paused. "The claimant will speak." She stood. She had prepared remarks. She delivered them without notes, in the even, carrying voice she had spent 23 years developing without knowing she was developing it. The voice of someone who had learned to make themselves heard in rooms that preferred to ignore them. She laid out the documentation, the historical record, the systematic suppression, the genealogical chain from her great-great-grandmother's sovereign signature to the present generation. She was precise and she was thorough, and she gave the room nothing to dismiss as sentiment, only evidence, structured and sourced, the cold architecture of a truth that had been buried for 140 years and was now standing in the light asking to be seen. When she finished, the hall held the particular silence of people processing something that had changed the shape of what they knew. Aldrich spoke first. "The documentation has been independently reviewed by my own historian. I find it credible." 2 other lords followed within minutes, then a third. The room was moving in a direction that had gravity now, and gravity is hard to argue with once it has begun. Draven had not spoken. Seraphine sat down and looked at him directly across the table and waited. He was doing the thing she recognized, the deep internal processing happening behind the stone exterior, the working through of something that had structural weight. She watched him do it and did not rush it. She had stopped rushing things that needed time to complete themselves. "The documentation," he said finally. His voice was controlled, precise. "Is authenticated." Not a question. "By 3 independent sources," she said. A pause. "Then the claim is legitimate," he said. The room registered this. Pack lords who had been watching with the careful neutrality of people who didn't want to commit to a losing side visibly recalibrated. The thorn block, what remained of it after Aldrich and Marin's departures, held very still. She had expected a fight. She had prepared for a fight, had built her case to withstand extended challenge, had walked into this room ready for Draven to contest every page of the documentation with the full resources of a dynasty's legal apparatus. He wasn't fighting. She watched him not fight and understood, slowly, what she was seeing. This was not capitulation from weakness. She had been in enough rooms with Draven Thorn to know the difference between a man conceding under pressure and a man making a choice he had arrived at through his own reasoning. What she was seeing was the second thing. He had pulled the troops from the Eastern Crossing. Torren's scouts had confirmed it 2 days before the summit. The supply train reversed, the forward position dissolved, the claim abandoned before it hardened into something that couldn't be undone without a shooting war. He had done that before he walked into this room. She had not expected that either. The summit session continued through the morning and into the afternoon, and the pieces of what she had built over 6 weeks assembled themselves into their final form with the particular satisfaction of structural work completing. Aldrich's signature led to Marin's formal declaration. Marin's declaration led to 3 border lords who had been waiting to see which side had momentum. The Highland buffer zone was formally designated as neutral territory, under joint oversight. Not hers, not Draven's, not Kael's, but the continent's, which was the outcome that actually served the most people and had therefore been the hardest to achieve. The Crestfall intelligence was the last item. Haas presented it himself, which she had not anticipated and which told her something about what had been happening inside the palace during the 6 weeks she'd been in the Highlands. He laid out the documented connections between Selene and Lord Crestfall's corridor strategy with the flat, procedural completeness of a man who had spent 40 years learning to deliver devastating information in the tone of administrative record-keeping. The room's response was the particular silence of people whose assumptions about existing alliances had just been invalidated. Selene was not at the summit. Lord Crestfall was. He had come planning to collect the corridor his daughter had spent 8 months building toward, and he sat at the far end of the table and listened to Haas read the documentation, and his face performed a series of expressions that were worth the entire 6 weeks of work it had taken to arrive at this moment. The Crestfall corridor claim was formally rejected before the afternoon session ended. Seraphine did not look at Draven when this happened. She looked at the table in front of her and breathed once, slowly, and let the moment be what it was. Not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter and more durable. The feeling of a thing completed, of a weight set down. When the summit formally concluded at the day's end, the Pack Lords dispersed in the way they do, in clusters of existing alliance and newly formed ones, the social architecture of the next decade taking its first shapes in corridor conversations and threshold handshakes. Seraphine stood near the eastern wall and let people come to her, which they did, steadily, 1 and 2 at a time. Lords who wanted to register their awareness of the bloodline claim, who wanted to establish that they had been on the right side before it was fully clear which side that was, who wanted to be seen acknowledging her by the people watching who they spoke to. She received each of them with the same quality of attention. She was gracious without being grateful. She was warm without being available. She was, without having planned it, exactly what she had always had the capacity to be, and the absence of the last 3 years' constraints allowed her to be it fully for the first time. Kale stayed near the wall, not hovering, present. She was speaking with a lowland representative when she felt the shift in the room's energy, the specific quality of approach that she had spent years learning to identify, the particular pressure that preceded Draven. The lowland lord saw it too and found a reason to conclude the conversation with efficient politeness. Draven stopped beside her. They stood together near the eastern wall for a moment, not looking at each other, watching the room as it continued its end-of-day dispersal. It was oddly reminiscent of the East Garden years ago. The two of them in proximity, saying nothing, the silence between them carrying more than most people's sentences. "The troops are back inside the border," he said. "I know. I did that before the summit. I know that too." A pause. "Celine is gone," he said. "She left the palace the day after Haas began the internal review." His voice carried the particular quality of a man reporting a fact he has already finished grieving, or at least finished the first stage of it. "I don't know where she went. I find that I don't particularly need to." Seraphine said nothing. "I owe you an acknowledgement," he said, still watching the room, still not looking at her directly, which she recognized as the only way he was capable of saying the things he was about to say, sideways, under cover of looking elsewhere, the way he had always managed the things that cost him. "What I did in that hall, the manner of it." A pause. "I knew it would damage you. I told myself that was unavoidable. That was a lie I told myself because the truth was harder." She looked at his profile. The jaw that had absorbed an impact at some point in its history. The eyes watching the room with the gray, complicated steadiness she had spent years believing she could read completely. "What was the truth?" she said. "That I was afraid." The words came out quietly, without the management quality covering them. "Of what you were becoming, of what the bond would mean if I let it mean what it actually was." A beat. "It was easier to choose something that didn't challenge me than to be worthy of something that did." The hall was thinning around them. Lord Aldrich passed with a brief nod. 2 border lords she didn't know well moved toward the exit in conversation. The room was becoming its own echo. She stood with what he had said and let it settle. There had been a version of herself, the version that had stood in that corridor entrance with her handmaiden adjusting her gown, who had wanted to hear those words more than almost anything, had catalogued his silences looking for evidence of exactly what he was telling her now, had built an architecture of patience and endurance around the hope that the real thing was in there, just inaccessible, just waiting for the right conditions to surface. That version of her understood why he was saying this. The version of her standing in this room now felt something different. Not the satisfaction of finally being right, not even the grief of what could have been. Something more completed than either. The specific stillness of a person who has moved far enough past a wound that they can look at it clearly without it reopening. "I believe you," she said. His posture shifted fractionally. "That doesn't change what happened," she said, "or what comes after it. I'm not asking you to understand that, Draven. I'm just telling you it's true." "I know." He said it with the full weight of a man who has arrived at a thing the long way and is not asking to be forgiven for the journey. I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know that I know what I lost. A pause. What I destroyed. She looked at him for a moment longer. You didn't destroy me, she said, and meant it without cruelty, without softness, with only the exactness of a thing that was true. You removed every external structure I'd been building on. That's different from destroying. She paused. Everything I built after that night, I built because I had to, because there was nothing left except what I actually was. She held his gaze. I don't think I would have found out what that was any other way. He looked at her with those gray eyes, and something passed through them that she would not name and did not need to name. Be well, Draven, she said. She turned and walked toward the eastern exit where Kyle was waiting with the quiet patience of someone who has learned that some things need to complete themselves on their own time. She heard Draven say, behind her, very quietly, in a voice she was certain was not meant to carry, she was always going to be more than I deserved. She did not stop walking. She did not need to hear it. She had not built what she built in order to hear it, but the words landed anyway, briefly, like the last light of something going down, and she let them land and let them go. The evening outside the summit hall was cold, with the familiar highland bite she had grown accustomed to in 6 weeks of living at altitude, and the stars were beginning to appear in the east, and the Black Wolf column was regrouping in the western courtyard, with the efficient, unhurried rhythm of people who had done what they came to do and were ready to move to what came next. Kyle fell into step beside her. They walked for a moment without speaking, crossing the courtyard toward the horses, and the familiar 2 feet of deliberate air between them carried something different tonight, charged differently, aware of itself differently, the way the air changes before weather arrives. She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. She looked at him. In the early evening light, in the courtyard of a building that had outlasted every political arrangement ever negotiated inside it, she looked at Kyle Duskbane and stopped calling it everything she had been calling it. What you said to Draven, she said, at the camp. I remember what I said. I've been calling it strategy, she said, the way you backed me, the way you showed up every morning as exactly what you said you'd be. She paused. I've been calling it a lot of things that weren't the right word. He was looking at her with the ice-water eyes at their stillest, and the depth she had spent 6 weeks trying not to look for was there, fully visible, patient in the way of something that has been waiting without pressure because it trusted the waiting was worth it. What's the right word? He said. She had not planned to say this here, in a courtyard, with horses nearby and wolves reorganizing equipment 30 feet away and the last light going gold over the highland ridge. She had not planned it, but she had learned, in the months since the worst night of her life had turned out to be the most important one, that the things worth saying rarely arrived at planned moments. They arrived when the conditions were finally right for them to survive the saying, when the person saying them had become someone capable of meaning them completely. You know what it is, she said. I want to hear you say it. She looked at him for a moment, at the jaw that had taken an impact somewhere in its history, at the eyes that had looked at her from the first night in the lamplit tent, like she was something to orient by. You are the only person, she said, who has ever stood beside me without needing me to be smaller for your comfort. She held his gaze. I don't have a clean word for what that is. I have the fact of it. He reached over and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep, with the complete, unhurried certainty of a person who has made a decision and has nothing to prove about it. That works, he said. She looked down at their joined hands and then back at him and felt something she had no previous reference point for, not the fragile provisional warmth of what she had once believed she had with Draven, but something structural, load-bearing, the kind of thing that doesn't need to announce itself because it doesn't need to convince anyone, least of all the people inside it. She had walked out of a hall 6 months ago with nothing but a bone-handled knife and 2 changes of clothes. And she had walked into that hall today as someone the continent could not dismiss or manage or quietly neutralize. And she had walked out of it again as herself, fully, finally, irrevocably herself. And that self was standing in a courtyard at evening in the company of a man who had never once asked her to be less of it. The becoming was complete, not because she had won, Not because Draven had conceded, or the bloodline claim was recognized, or the Crestfall corridor was dead. Those were outcomes. And outcomes mattered, but they were not the completion. The completion was internal. The knowledge, settled into bone and breath, and the particular quiet of a person who has stopped fighting the shape of their own life. That everything she had endured had been exactly sufficient to produce exactly this. A woman standing in her own name, in her own right, with her own history, and her own ground, and her own choice, held by a hand that held her the way she was, rather than the way she would be convenient. The summit was over. The world that came after it was beginning. Around them, the Black Wolf column was ready to move, and the highland ridge above was going dark with the particular beauty of northern evenings. And somewhere behind them in the summit hall, a man was sitting alone in a room that had just confirmed everything he'd lost, learning the specific, long curriculum of a lesson he had written for himself. She did not think about him. She turned north, her hand in Kael's, and walked toward what came next. The horses moved, the stars came out, and the woman who had once been a rejected Luna walked home through the highland dark, carrying nothing she had not earned, belonging to no one she had not chosen, afraid of nothing she had not already survived. That was the whole of it. That was enough.